Les racistes veulent faire disparaître 2 ou 3 races parce qu'ils ne les aiment pas. Les antiracistes les effacent toutes parce qu'ils prétendent qu'elles n'existent pas.
So, nationalism. What is it exactly? A lot of people talk about it today as if it's outright genocide. Even the Catholic Church recently held a meeting on the threat of rising nuovi nazionalismi. Well, according to Wikipedia, nationalism is a political, social, and economic ideology and movement characterized by the promotion of the interests of a particular nation, especially with the aim of gaining and maintaining the nation's sovereignty over its homeland. Nationalism holds that each nation should govern itself, free from outside interference, that a nation is a natural and ideal basis for a polity, and that the nation is the only rightful source of political power. Now, this doesn't sound very controversial, unless of course you don't believe in the very concept of a nation. But what is a nation? The word itself comes from the Latin natio, meaning that which has been born, and its early derivatives expressed notions of tribe, family, and kinship. The connotations of the word in English have changed over time, but older senses signified a race of people or an aggregation of persons of the same ethnic family. This brings us to the somewhat redundant term, ethnic nationalism. Ethnos is from Greek and originally corresponded to notions of tribe, family, and kinship as well. In fact, in the earliest Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible, the term ta ethne corresponded to the Hebrew word goy, which at the time of translation simply meant a nation or a tribe. While many people assert that the concept of a nation never held intrinsic ties to ethnicity or race until the 19th century, even a cursory examination of antiquity shows that the most basic elements of political organization were firmly situated atop kinship ties. This is likely because on the most fundamental level, we humans are essentially no different from any other organism, insofar that our ultimate goal is to copy our genes and those genes most similar to our own. This brings us to the concept of civic nationalism, which is something people offer in opposition to so-called ethnic nationalism. But the word civic also has an interesting etymological story to tell. The words civic, city, and citizenship are all cognates of the Latin word civitas, which denoted the concept of Roman citizenship. Interestingly, the word cognate itself originally meant allied by blood, connected or related by birth, of the same parentage, or descended from a common ancestor. Now, the word civis, as derived from civitas, is what the Romans called an inhabitant of a city, and at the time, a civis was by default closely related to anyone else within his or her city. As Ernest Renan, the arguable father of modern civic nationalism, pointed out in his 1882 treatise, Qu'est-ce qu'une nation? Quote, l'attribut à la cité antique n'était qu'une extension de la famille. À Sparte, à Athènes, tous les citoyens étaient parents à des degrés plus ou moins rapprochés. However, Renan also said that, quote, l'homme n'est esclave ni de sa race, ni de sa langue, ni de sa religion, ni du cours de fleuve, ni de la direction des chaînes de montagne. Une grande agrégation d'hommes, sains d'esprit et chauds de cœur, crée une conscience morale qui s'appelle une nation. Now, at the time of writing, Renan indeed found himself within a France comprised of different peoples speaking different languages. He also spoke of the ancient Egyptians, the Chinese, and the Assyrians in his work. Thus, a modern reader might be tempted to view his commentary on the quote-unquote 3 or 4 different races of places like Switzerland as being analogous to a modern comparison between the Uyghur and the Mandarin, or between the Persians and the Arabs. But these would not be one-to-one comparisons. These are differences similar to those found between the Scots and the Germans, that is to say, they are relatively minor. Renan also said things like, quote, l'oubli, et je dirais même l'erreur historique, sont un facteur essentiel de la création d'une nation. Et c'est ainsi que le progrès des études historiques est souvent pour la nationalité un danger. L'investigation historique, en effet, remet en lumière les faits de violence qui se sont passés à l'origine de toutes les formations politiques, même de celles dont les conséquences ont été le plus bienfaisantes. L'unité se fait toujours brutalement. La réunion de la France du Nord et de la France du Midi a été le résultat d'une extermination et d'une terreur continuée pendant près d'un siècle. But perhaps his sentiments here are better encapsulated in his later line, Or, l'essence d'une nation est que tous les individus aient beaucoup de choses en commun, et aussi que tous aient oublié bien des choses. Renan reveals that violence, conquest, and empire are often the mechanisms by which a new nationality is formed. But he also shares a potential antecedent to George Orwell's famous quote, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." And what do we see today if not several different political and social bodies vying for control over the past? Revisionism is rampant today to the point where we are seriously considering that Black Africans and Middle Eastern Muslims were part of Nordic Viking culture. Americans are being taught that our nation's founding fathers intended to create an ethno-cultural melting pot, when in fact the very first Naturalization Act they passed, and practically everyone up until 1965, rejected that notion altogether with explicit language. Yes, France was eventually united, but it is important to note that the various peoples of France were not all that different from each other to begin with, at least not in a relative sense when compared to Africans, Arabs, or even the Algerian Berbers. In other words, they had beaucoup de choses en commun, and yet it still took a century of warfare to unite them. What kind of a person looks at the unification of France and says, "Hey, I want to try that again, but this time with even more diversity"? Assimilation is increasingly rendered more improbable, difficult, and violent accordingly with the size and distinctiveness of the incoming outgroup. Despite our general similarity to the Anglo-Saxon colonists, in America it took hundreds of years for us German Americans to become fully assimilated into greater Anglo-American society. For years, we refused to speak English. Places like Pennsylvania were absolutely dominated by German culture, and regardless of our eventual assimilation, many would rightly claim that our presence utterly changed the Anglo-American landscape. This speaks not to how anyone and everyone can assimilate to any culture, but rather to how difficult it is for even us Europeans to assimilate to other European cultures. And on that note, it is an unfortunate fact that despite hundreds of years of coexistence, Blacks, Hispanics, and East Asians living in America have not assimilated or miscegenated into greater Anglo-American society in any way that resembles how the Germans, the Irish, the Italians, or the Greeks have.
There were the whites and the blacks and the Chinese. We all stayed in our lanes and we were fine until we crossed over.
If you enter the prison system in the US, you will notice that inmates generally self-segregate based on race. If you visit a major city, you will notice that neighborhoods are divided along racial lines. Even in leftist universities that abhor the very concept of race, non-white students form organizations that exclude others on that very basis. Interestingly, it is only white people who are not granted this same privilege. In fact, we white Americans are often considered generic people, with no real interests or concerns that differ in any way from other distinct groups. Why is it that white Americans are considered generic? Could it be because we all know inherently that if the United States were a cake, they would be its batter? We should also be asking ourselves here, if it took so much bloodshed in a place like France to unite various European subgroups, how much violence will it take to unite Africans, Arabs, East Asians, and the rest of humanity? Is it even possible? As Ernest Renan also said, quote, "La division de l'Europe est trop grande pour qu'une tentative de domination universelle ne provoque pas très vite une coalition qui fasse rentrer la nation ambitieuse dans ses bords naturels." And what is happening today if not a rising rejection of universal domination of Europe from a single polity? It's true that Ernest Renan said things like, "On confond la race avec la nation," but nowhere does he argue that racial and ethnic differences will utterly disappear and become meaningless. Nor does he argue that all races have the potential to cohabitate the same space. In fact, at one point, he even said, "La scission de l'Orient et de l'Occident était inévitable." Not that I believe that he was a quote-unquote ethnic nationalist, but in my opinion he was attempting to describe how the notion of nation in the 19th century had situated itself somewhere between an ethnic tribe and an empire. The term nationalism only came about in the 19th century, and thus people often claim that the concepts underpinning it didn't exist prior. But surely no one thinks that the ancient Greek city-states, the nomadic Israelites, or the Comanche people of North America had no sense of collective identity or shared destiny based on blood ties.
You're all individuals!
Now, perhaps it's true that the various European peoples, such as the Gauls or the Veneti, didn't see themselves as part of a larger European identity. But one, this doesn't really mean they were all interchangeable with Africans and East Asians, and two, the reason your average European in the ancient world didn't think in 19th century racial terms was largely because most of them never encountered people of other races. All the various ethnicities on the continent carry the same basic DNA admixture from 3 or 4 ancient populations, and the distinctions between, say for example, the Greeks and Norwegians is really only the amount of Yamnaya or Neolithic farmer DNA they carry. Now, this is not to say that Greeks and Norwegians are identical, but they have more in common with each other than either does with any non-European population. People will invariably focus here on the fact that there is no single quote-unquote pure European, and that there are groups at the end of the European ethnic spectrum who carry significant amounts of non-European DNA. Geneticists such as David Reich will argue that Europe's past is one of admixture, and thus will continue to be by observing that the Yamnaya peoples came into Europe thousands of years ago and raped and pillaged their way into the gene pool. The rationale is that Europeans mixed before with people from the Russian steppe, so there's no reason not to mix again with sub-Saharan Africans, Arabs, or really anyone whom outsiders want them to. But would we tell a woman whose father raped her mother that because her past is one of forced admixture, that her future is one in which she will inevitably allow random men to ejaculate inside her? The logic being that all men have a penis, thus they must all be the same. Perhaps it's no coincidence that the European word nation is itself a feminine word, meaning to give birth. After all, it is women who give birth to a nation, and in a very real sense, like a woman, a nation can be raped. Now, I'm sure all of that sounds quite hyperbolic, but consider that a nation is comprised of millions of individual women, and that today in the Western world, women are scolded, berated, and harassed if they openly express that they only wish to date and marry fellow Western men. And when they are repeatedly raped by foreign men, the media ignores it or covers it up. David Reich is a highly intelligent and educated man with first-hand knowledge of how much rape and violence occurs when two different peoples are forced to cohabitate the same physical and political space, and yet he is telling the Western world that despite all the historical and genetic evidence of the past, somehow everything is going to peacefully work out with unprecedented levels of mass migration. Reich points out in his book, Who We Are and How We Got Here, that ancient populations in the Near East, as different from each other as Europeans and East Asians are today, may have peacefully collapsed into genetic homogeneity about 10,000 years ago. He considers this a precedent for what is supposedly occurring today in the modern information age. But this assumes that recent mass migration over the past 50 years has been a consensual act, and that it has resulted in high interracial marriage rates. Citizens in Western nations today increasingly want to reduce immigration, and while interracial marriage has gone up since the 1960s, it is by no means the norm, and interracial divorce rates are substantially higher than their intraracial counterparts. This is in spite of massive media efforts to promote diverse pairings. Reich also presents no reason to conclude here that a quantity of genetic differences in the ancient Near East equated to a quality of genetic differences. Some studies suggest that certain interracial marriage combinations are more stable than others. Thus, it could be the case that the genetic differences between these 4 ancient populations of the Near East didn't present compatibility issues. After all, these were out of Africa populations that had co-evolved at a similar latitude. On one hand, Reich acknowledges that modern Europeans and their subgroups are genetically homogeneous, and on the other hand, he feels the need to quell any notions we may have of ethnic or genetically based national identity by highlighting that none of us are quote-unquote pure. While I highly respect Reich's intelligence and can appreciate some of his concerns, I find his perspective on this matter to be borderline autistic. Consider that if Thomas Rousel were to declare that he is more ethnically British than, say, for example, David Lammy, a supporter of Reich's perspective might respond by saying that there's no such thing as a pure Brit. Yet even Reich himself acknowledges that the mass of people historically present on the British Isles for the last several thousand years do share a particular genetic admixture. Now, whether or not this fits your view of post-World War II British identity, Thomas most certainly retains more of this genetic admixture than does David. While Reich's book is praiseworthy for its scope, detail, and academic prowess, it has a lot of subtle leftist undertones, and its presentation of the information reveals a motive to prevent people from drawing certain conclusions. Moreover, while David Reich may feel that everyone is equally entitled to all of human history, I highly doubt he feels the same way about the land of his childhood summers. What I personally find ironic about the situation is that people praise his work for how it shows that we humans are hopelessly mixed and interchangeable, and yet these same people are often the first to jubilate about authentic ethnic restaurants because of their distinctiveness. They want real curry restaurants run by real Indians, and consider a Chinese establishment owned and operated by a white person to be inappropriate. They're also the same people who typically lecture us all on how diverse the Roman and Greek empires were. Sure, they certainly had cosmopolitan urban centers, but let's not forget that these were empires put forth by relatively small ethnic tribes. The Latins exported their language, culture, and to a certain extent their genes to other regions, as did the Greeks. It's not as if the people of southern France, Italy, or Greece were encountering Ethiopians, Arabs, and Persians on a daily basis. People want to claim today that because some black African may have ended up near Hadrian's Wall, that this somehow makes modern black Africans as British as William Shakespeare. Yet no one today thinks that because a small number of Solutrean Europeans may have migrated to the Americas during the last glacial maximum, that this somehow makes white Americans Native Americans. Imagine a white guy showing up to a First Nations rally and declaring that he's just as Native American as the Cherokee. Why is it any less ludicrous that an Ivorian shows up in Italy and declares that he's just as Italian as Dante Alighieri? Proponents of civic nationalism often talk about how they don't care who comes into the country as long as they're offering something of high value. This is often viewed as noble for its virtuous adherence to colorblindness, when in reality, it's inhumane, greedy, and has negative long-term consequences. Look at it this way: Europeans have an average IQ of about 100, Hispanics and Arabs about 85, Sub-Saharan Africans about 70, while East Asians sit at around 105. The 99th percentile of the European IQ distribution is about 135. For Hispanics, it's about 115, and for Africans, it's about 105. To put this into perspective, 1 out of 102 Europeans, 741 Hispanics, and 136,074 Africans has an IQ of 135. Now, these figures are based off of a European standard deviation of 15, which means that 68% of Europeans fall within 15 points above or below 100. The size of a standard deviation can vary between specific populations. For example, Finns probably have the highest mean IQ in Europe, but their standard deviation is much smaller than the general European average, meaning fewer Finns are distributed at the high or low end of the IQ bell curve. So, they have fewer unintelligent people than other European ethnic groups, but likewise, they don't have as many geniuses as, say, for example, the Swedes. That said, although the previous figures cited may not show pinpoint accuracy, they do give us a general idea of the unequal distribution of intelligence across continental populations. While high IQ Africans, Arabs, and Amerindians do exist, they are rare relative to their European and East Asian counterparts. It thus follows that when a high IQ African or Hispanic leaves their home nation, it's a much bigger loss for their people than it is a gain for ours. Actually, it might be more pragmatic to encourage high IQ white people with advanced degrees in hard sciences to have more children and to move to third world nations in order to bolster the local intelligentsia. After all, if race truly doesn't matter, then no one should care if it's intelligent white people having more babies and expanding. But most people would probably view this as neocolonialism, even though they might also consider mass migration of non-Europeans in the opposite direction to be a noble, just, and enriching phenomenon. The double standard should tell you that endless immigration into the West is not about political asylum, philanthropy, or lifting anyone out of poverty. Even if Hondurans were all starving, Mexico is perfectly capable of absorbing anyone from Central America who is in that kind of dire need. Likewise, Israel and many oil-rich Gulf nations are capable of taking in a few million Africans, but they don't. The reason is because there is no magical property of geopolitical borders that somehow turns all migrants into cultural automatons of the host nation. Even if we put aside the fact that Latinos overwhelmingly vote left in the US, the supposed Hispanic conservative minority is still antithetical to the supposed colorblind values conservative Americans aspire to when Hispanic conservatives consider their Hispanic ethnicity to be of any significant importance. In fact, all of conservatism in America today is utterly meaningless, as evidenced by the oxymoronic concept of neoconservatism, which painfully speaks to how its Jewish founders wanted to conserve their hegemonic power once they positioned themselves on top.
Look, to be totally honest, if things are so bad as you say with the white working class, don't you want to get new Americans in who aren't going to be... I'm serious. You can make a case that this is going on too long and this is too crazy probably, and I hope this thing isn't being videotaped or ever shown anywhere.
Conservatism is nothing more than the concept of protecting your ethnic group's power structure and cultural dominance. America is little more today than an economic forum in which different ethnic groups are vying for power, with many white centrists delusionally continuing to believe that they can somehow convince everyone to give up their ethnocentrism and to compete in an endless free market of individuals. Now, hypothetically, even if all the people in the world suddenly dropped their ethnocentrism and began intermarrying and producing children, because of unequal IQ distributions across populations, a mixed master race would inevitably form, comprised first and foremost of East Asians, followed by Europeans, followed by a very small admixture from other groups whose genetic contributions would be almost entirely destroyed in the miscegenation process. Assortative mating habits of humans are such that individuals rarely select partners from drastically different socioeconomic backgrounds, and these backgrounds often function as a proxy for IQ. So, putting ethnocentrism aside entirely, you will never naturally see masses of Aboriginals intermarrying with masses of ethnic Chinese immigrants to Australia because of dramatic IQ disparities between these two populations. The concept and pursuit of Homo globus would effectively divide the world even more dramatically into dark skin and light skin, with a Eurasian upper class and an equatorial underclass. Now, I only bring up the notion of Homo globus in a rhetorical sense, however, because I don't think it's even possible. It's not a coincidence that as whites become more of a minority in their own countries, their sense of racial and ethnic identity has begun to rise. In all likelihood, this is not so much a product of internet chat rooms, dangerous propaganda, trollish memes, or even Austrian painting literature. It's an inevitable product of biology, and it's how all ethnic groups typically behave when they come under threat.
Their racial identity, there's basically an outbreak of tribalism, which explains what's going on the far right. What's going on the left is a bit of a new twist. What you have is a coalition of different tribal identities that aren't large enough to marshal a force on their own, and so they're united, and together they are a formidable force. But what's going to happen is that's an unstable entity. At the point that that force gains power, it's going to come apart as internal dynamics rip it up. It's not capable of restraining the version that recurs on the right, the version that does manifest as white nationalism. That version is stable because it does represent an actual population that has an evolutionary basis for remaining cohesive.
Now, before anyone accuses me of taking Bret Weinstein out of context, his official position is one that condemns ethnic tribalism, and he would like people to move past it. While he acknowledges that white people have an evolutionary basis for organizing along ethnic lines, he doesn't support it. Interestingly, however, he never calls out Zionism, which is the world's most preeminent form of ethnic tribalism, responsible for the displacement of over 700,000 Palestinians in 1948 alone. Bret also repeatedly alludes to the idea that white people shouldn't organize along ethnic lines because supposedly whenever they do, they become genocidal. Yet Europeans have been funding a Jewish ethno-state for the last 70 years precisely because of their collective identity, albeit one shaped around guilt. I suspect that you'll never hear Weinstein say that Germans born after 1945 shouldn't be held liable for the past, that Poland doesn't owe Israel anything, or that maybe the US shouldn't be paying Israel $3.8 billion every year, while our own infrastructure crumbles and Israel can afford to crash probes into the moon. Bret isn't a centrist. He's a globalist who can pass as a centrist because of how far the Overton window has moved to the left. The reality Bret is fighting against is that while some people are certainly open to the idea of giving up their ethnic identity, most are not. Even in places like Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and other South American nations where a fair amount of miscegenation has taken place, large white populations still exist despite hundreds of years of cohabitation with Amerindians. It's not unlike oil and water separating after having been violently shaken up. Population genetics show us that most miscegenation in Latin America took place during the initial arrival of the conquistadors, and was mostly the product of European men mating with indigenous women to the exclusion of local males. Now, this undoubtedly involved a lot of rape, as was the case with the Aryan/Yamnaya invasion of Europe, wherein the males of Neolithic farmer and Western hunter-gatherer groups were cucked, so to speak, by the former. Although it is plausible that a certain amount of the miscegenation in both cases was female hypergamy. From an evolutionary standpoint, women tend to desire men who are dominant or who have greater access to resources. That pretty much describes the asymmetrical relationship of the conquistadors with the natives. And interestingly, if you look into the history of the Mexican word chingar, which is used in phrases like hijo de la chingada, an interesting narrative around ethnic conflict begins to emerge.
Hijo de la chingada.
The root of the word chingada likely originates from a Romani language in Europe, but at this point it's tied to a very real extent to the native woman La Malinche, who is often viewed as a traitor to the pre-colonial Mexican peoples. As the story goes, she was a slave handed over to the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés, after which she not only gave him a son, but she also played an important role in helping him conquer the region. She was a talented interpreter and diplomat who advocated on behalf of the Spaniards on numerous occasions, and she even foiled a native plot to kill Cortés and his men. Now, many would argue, however, that she did this against her will and under duress as a captive. But what's interesting is that her stepfather was the one who initially sold her into slavery to the Mayans. The reason she was a talented interpreter was because she was passed around between various tribes and had to learn several languages and dialects. Eventually, she ended up with the cacique of Tabasco, who then handed her over to Cortés as an act of concession after being defeated by him in battle. The question we need to ask ourselves is who betrayed whom in this case? Did La Malinche betray her people, or did her people betray her? She might simply have been a battered woman who decided to be loyal to European invaders because, comparatively speaking, they treated her a little better. Regardless of whether or not her participation in the conquest of Mexico was voluntary or forced, she remains a divisive and controversial figure today. Consider that the term malinchista can depict a treacherous, deceitful woman, or someone who prefers foreign cultures to their own. Although in more recent times, Mexican feminist movements have sought to portray her as a victim of circumstance, and as the mother of the new Mexican mestizo people. I find the indigenous anger thrown at La Malinche somewhat analogous to that thrown at Ephialtes, who betrayed the Spartans to the Persians at Thermopylae. It's not an entirely accurate account, but in the 2006 film The 300, Ephialtes is depicted as a deformed mutant, initially rejected by the Spartans at birth. Later in life, he attempts to regain his Spartan identity and is rejected once more. In retaliation, he betrays Leonidas to the Persians by showing them a pass around which they can flank the Spartans. Even though we may hate him for it, we can still understand why he did it. Our compatriots can have understandable motivations, perhaps even justifications for their treasonous behavior, and yet we can still acknowledge that they've become a threat. The bottom line is that people of all ethnic groups generally dislike it when their kin betray them to outsiders, even when the outsiders belong to the same race, and even when they do so out of necessity. After World War II, for example, many Dutch, French, and Italian women were punished for having slept and collaborated with the Germans. No doubt some of these women were just opportunistic and hypergamous, but surely many of them did so out of pure desperation. Even today in Latin America, people who are majority indigenous Amerindian tend to stick to their own kind, just as mestizos tend to marry other mestizos. Likewise, castizo and pure Europeans tend to marry within their own groups as well. It's largely a myth that Latinos, quote-unquote, have completely moved beyond racial boundaries and would intermarry with other groups at normal rates were it not for the artificially imposed Spanish caste system. As someone who's been living in Latin America for quite some time, I can tell you that this is pretty much nonsense. I've had many conversations with people that started with "Yo no soy racista," pero followed by a diatribe about immigrants, refugees, and black people. Something I feel compelled to emphasize here is that IQ is not necessarily the end-all measure of identity, either at the individual or at the national level. If Jeffrey Dahmer, for example, had an IQ 10 points higher, he probably would not have refrained from kidnapping, murdering, and eating homosexual men. Likewise, I doubt that lowering Mr. Rogers' IQ by 10 points would have resulted in him turning into a psychopathic serial rapist. To a similar extent, if the mean German IQ were suddenly raised 5 points, Germans probably would not start behaving exactly like the Japanese. Likewise, if African Americans suddenly had an IQ equal to that of Ashkenazi Jews, do we really think they'd all convert to Judaism and move to Israel, assuming Israel wouldn't subject them to DNA tests to prove their Jewish heritage? That said, IQ does correlate to varying degrees with a variety of behaviors, and is much more important at the national level in terms of economic productivity and infrastructural maintenance. For example, if the Japanese mean IQ dropped to 85, Japan's infrastructure would not be as well maintained, and its crime rates would almost certainly go up. It's unlikely, however, that Tokyo would resemble a black city like Detroit, because the Japanese, like many East Asians, are simply more cooperative and conformist than other peoples in the world. This is likely caused to a significant degree by their genetic composition. Thus, even with a lower IQ, Japan would probably resemble a place like Vietnam more so than, say, Eritrea. As an aside, intelligence researcher Michael Woodley has been compiling and interpreting datasets on ancient and modern Greek DNA, recently released from David Reich's medical lab. Woodley's work so far is highly suggestive that the Greek Dark Age between the Mycenaean civilization and the Classical period was likely due to a decline in the presence of genetic alleles associated with intelligence. In other words, the dumber Greeks outbred the smarter Greeks because the smarter Greeks had enabled them to do so. Now, with all that said, it's highly probable that genes, culture, and geography work in unison via a feedback loop to shape a nation and its people. For example, seasonal changes in Europe and East Asia probably selected for higher IQs and lower time preferences, but the cultures that came from that initial selection pressure likely selected further for those traits. Europeans mercilessly executed criminals for hundreds of years, and criminality correlates to lower deferrals of gratification and lower IQs. Additionally, because Europeans began to live in large urban areas, when the Black Plague hit, it wiped out about 80% of the working class, who, statistically speaking, have lower IQs. This is probably a good point to discuss the differences between nations like North and South Korea, wherein we have a genetically identical stock of humans with extremely different socioeconomic outcomes. This is not evidence, however, that IQ is mostly environmental. All the North-South Korean contrast shows us is how Koreans can be stifled or nurtured by environmental factors. It is not evidence that Africans have been held back by colonialism. The South Korean IQ in the 1970s was likely still higher than the African American IQ is today, even after African Americans have received any potential application of the Flynn effect. According to a paper from an Irish university in 2012, South Koreans gained an average of 7.7 IQ points per decade between 1970 and 1990. This places their pre-Flynn effect IQ at about 90, whereas today it's about 105. This proves that there are certainly things we can do to improve IQ, or rather that under certain conditions IQ can be stifled, but it also strongly suggests that the gaps between continental populations cannot be bridged. As an aside, the Vietnamese have an average IQ of about 90 and are, on average, 3 times poorer than African Americans. This does not mean that I advocate treating every individual based on their racial aggregate IQ score. For example, there would be no logical reason to place a low IQ special needs Japanese child in a gifted and talented class for high IQ Nigerians just because the Japanese generally have higher IQs than the Nigerians. That said, it's equally important to realize that African and East Asian populations do not respectively add up to the same aggregate potential. When we look at test scores, average lifetime income, voting habits, crime rates, GDP, etc. for each group, we need to take into consideration that the differences in group outcomes are never going to be equal. And with all that said, it is entirely possible that an individual such as Jared Taylor can grow up in a place like Japan and be culturally Japanese in a near perfect sense. Likewise, it is possible that a man such as Thomas Sowell can be an Anglo-American in a similar sense. The problem only truly arises when large numbers of different peoples show up in a given ethnocultural setting. When this happens, the aggregate differences will begin to manifest, and people will naturally start to coalesce along tribal lines. As much as it offends modern sensibilities, I want to retain my European identity and have a homeland to go to where I can unapologetically embrace this. Now, you may consider this attitude racist, and it may very well be, but in today's clown world, I honestly don't know what the f that means anymore. White flight is racist, gentrification is racist, trees and cameras are racist, little kids selling lemonade are racist, Viking runes are racist, and perhaps worst of all, white women who have mixed babies with black men are still f***ing racist. Well, according to Merriam-Webster, racism is a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Oxford defines it as a prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. The Italian dictionary Garazzanti defines it as tendenza a considerare la razza come fattore determinante dello sviluppo civile di una società e quindi a evitare mescolanze con altri popoli, considerati di razza inferiore, mediante la discriminazione o, in casi estremi, mediante la persecuzione e la loro distruzione. Oppure, ogni tendenza che favorisca o determini discriminazioni sociali. The Real Academia Española defines racismo as exacerbación del sentido racial de un grupo étnico que suele motivar la discriminación o persecución de otro u otros con los que convive. And the French dictionary Larousse defines it as idéologie fondée sur la croyance qu'il existe une hiérarchie entre les groupes humains, les races, comportement inspiré par cette idéologie, ou attitude d'hostilité systématique à l'égard d'une catégorie déterminée de personnes. Honestly, I'd go through several other languages if I could, but those are the ones I'm most familiar with. In any event, you can see that throughout the Western world, there is some variation in how racism is defined, although most of these definitions do touch base on notions of hierarchies and racial/ethnic discrimination. But if we examine the word discrimination, we find that it originally conveyed little more than the notion of discernment. Essentially, people who hate discrimination hate discernment, and yet they claim to adore diversity, when really they probably just despise white people. When researching the word racism, I happened upon an article in Affinity magazine entitled, "Dear White People, Your Dictionary Definition of Racism is Wrong." The author boldly states that, quote, "The majority of writers for popular and academic dictionaries have been white men. In the Western world, as there are systems in place which privilege white people, it is not surprising to see that the definition of racism put forward by white men is inaccurate," unquote. Well, considering that English originated on the British Isles and has been historically spoken by mostly white Europeans, it really shouldn't come as a surprise that its lexicographers are also predominantly white Europeans. Moreover, the author of this article has a fundamental misunderstanding of how lexicography works. Writing, compiling, and updating dictionaries is a process wherein lexicographers go through hundreds, if not thousands of instances wherein a word is used every year, and then they distill the most common meanings the speaking population has given to it. To put it another way, lexicographers do not invent definitions. They describe how native speakers use words. For example, if a large majority of the population suddenly began referring to cats as dogs and dogs as cats, lexicographers would have no choice but to reflect this in their work. A less extreme but nonetheless historical occurrence of this was the English word terrific, which in the 1600s meant very frightening, but came to mean excellent in the 1800s. This phenomenon is called semantic drift, but dictionaries seek to reflect this with multiple entries and are continually updated as popular usage changes. In fact, the irony here is that the article in question is probably contributing to the next updated entry on racism. The author takes an audacious step further, however, and proclaims that, quote, "There is simply no credibility in white people defining racism," unquote. This is also ironic since he is asserting that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities. In this case, he asserts that an entire race of people is inherently incompetent in certain intellectual activities. To be fair, and perhaps more precise, he said that there is no credibility in white people defining racism, so perhaps rather than incompetent, he simply views us as inherently untrustworthy. Either way, his attitude is one of hostilité systématique à l'égard d'une catégorie déterminée de personnes, not to mention that it represents a tendenza che favorisca o determini discriminazioni sociali. How convenient it is then that white men wrote those definitions, seeing how he considers those definitions wholly inaccurate for the simple fact that white men wrote them. It's pretty clear that what this author, and others like him, want is for everyone to believe that only white people can be racist, and that racism is an exclusive tool of white supremacy. The beginning of the article states, quote, "Racism as an ideology originated from European scientists in the 17th century during the Atlantic slave trade. They invented it in order to differentiate themselves from those with different skin colors and darker features, creating a racial hierarchy that continues to this day. It would simply be incorrect to deny that the history of racism has been, and continues to be, one of white supremacy, as the label white has always been an indication of superiority," unquote. Now, if I wanted to play the same game as him, I'd point out that the word racism wasn't used to any significant degree until after the 1940s. But even so, to say that no one recognized racial differences and used them to create or implement a hierarchy of sorts until the time of the Atlantic slave trade requires some rigorous mental gymnastics to get away from the core issue, which is that people have historically sought to conquer and dominate outgroups because they were different.
Before, we used to be alone in the forest, but now the Bantus come to collect leaves and wood to build their houses with, or to build fires with. This scares the animals that we're trying to hunt. Moreover, when they come across us, they force us to work for them and also beat us.
This is a hard job, but we have no tools or land of our own, so we have to work for the Bantus. This is the way it is.
The Bantu peoples of West Africa, thousands of years ago, long before European colonialism, rapidly expanded into the east and the south, where they ethnically cleansed entire sections of the continent. One of the key differences, however, between the Bantu enslavement of the Pygmies and the white enslavement of the Bantu was that the Bantu never really attempted to use any kind of scientific method to categorize the differences between themselves and the Pygmies. On the other hand, they never developed a writing system, a two-story building, or even a wheel until European colonialism, so why should this be expected? The North African Berbers and Arabs invaded southern and eastern Europe and enslaved millions of white people between the 8th and 19th centuries. And in case you're inclined to ignore the racial proxy of Islam and Christianity, the economy of this slave trade dictated that European women of the fairest hair and complexion were of the highest value and most sought after by Arab men. India's caste system originated in antiquity long before the British people ever showed up there, and the system persists today in practice despite efforts to abolish it. The grudge that the world holds against Europeans largely hinders on the fact that between the 17th and 19th centuries, Europeans began categorizing racial differences on paper. Now, were I a leftist and I wanted to demonize Europeans even further, I would point out that the European tradition of qualifying racial differences dates back to long before the Atlantic slave trade. Hippocrates wrote in great detail about racial differences in his Airs, Waters, Places. Now that said, people love to point out that the ancient Greeks viewed Nordic Europeans as uncivilized barbarians, as if the Greeks holding a Greek-centric view somehow undermines the notion of Greek ethnocentrism. As Herodotus said in an attempt to analyze the hostilities between Persians and Greeks, quote, "If anyone, no matter who, were given the opportunity of choosing from amongst all the nations in the world the set of beliefs which he thought best, he would inevitably, after careful considerations of their relative merits, choose that of his own country. Everyone, without exception, believes his own native customs and the religion he was brought up in to be the best. And that being so, it is unlikely that anyone but a madman would mock at such things. There is abundant evidence that this is the universal feeling about the ancient customs of one's country." Herodotus was actually commenting here on the reign of Cambyses II, a Persian king whom he condemned as a madman for having attempted to deride religious rites and customary observances. The greatest incitement to violence in a people, after all, is typically the destruction of their culture. Thus, why would we expect anything less today than a rise in white racial awareness as political forces begin to dismantle European cultures? Now, it's true that in this translation Herodotus made no mention of race, but does Herodotus strike us as the type of guy who would have said something like, "Hey, we're all blank slates, therefore the Persians can totally replace all of us Greeks"? Secondly, he didn't really need to mention race or ethnicity because, once again, countries in the ancient world were largely an extension of kinship. A culture is nothing more than the set of beliefs and ideals that have helped a particular people survive to the current moment. In other words, culture is a group evolutionary strategy. Think and act like this, do this and that under these circumstances, and history has proven to us that we will survive. This is why people venerate their cultures, because their culture is what has allowed their genes to be passed on successfully. It's not very profound, but the meaning of life is to copy one's genes and others most similar. The differences in culture are the differences in human strategies for passing on different gene sets under different environmental conditions and pressures. Even within a racial group, there is competition among men for women. But when an outside force threatens the tribe, the men will band together because in the end, if you die in combat and fail to pass on your genes, the next best thing is that your next of kin does. Sure, your sister could be taken as a bride by the invaders and in theory pass on some of your genes, but the invaders are more distantly related to you, and thus not as many genes, similar to your own, will be passed on. If your sister marries your fourth or fifth or sixth cousin, though, from an evolutionary perspective, she is passing on more of your genetic material. Think back to the Greek city-states, who often warred amongst themselves, but who formed an alliance when a larger, more substantially foreign threat was at their doorstep. Now, I didn't intend on dedicating so much time to this Affinity magazine article, but the author has too many important things to say to ignore, so allow me to continue with that. Quote, "If we look at the word racism, we see that it is made up of race and the suffix ism. This suffix is used to denote a system, which, at least in the Western world, is a system of white supremacy. This clearly differentiates racism from prejudice. Anyone can be prejudiced toward anyone else, regardless of their race. People of color can certainly be prejudiced toward white people. However, it is not racism because there is no larger system in place which oppresses white people." These are just some of the reasons why the dictionary definition of racism is invalid. If you or someone you know ever feels the need to screenshot the definition of racism and use it in an argument, just remember that the definition of ketchup says that it is spicy. Well, his distrust of white lexicographers is now all-encompassing and no longer limited to matters of racism, as evidenced by his problem with their definition of a condiment, which, by the way, is perfectly accurate. Spicy is defined as having the quality, flavor, or fragrance of spice, and spice is defined as any of various aromatic vegetable products, such as pepper or nutmeg, used to season or flavor foods. When something is spicy, it is not necessarily hot or piquant. Admittedly, I would not define ketchup as spicy today were I a lexicographer. The semantic drift has been sufficient to cause some confusion. This doesn't mean, however, that I've lost all faith and confidence in white lexicographers. Now, I agree with the author that prejudice and racism are distinct, but social constructs such as affirmative action, white privilege, and forced diversity quotas are nonetheless larger systems that target individuals based on their racial identity. These constructs are designed to punish, hinder, or displace white individuals on the basis of their race. In order to better understand what's going on today with the concepts of racism, I think we have to look at the word race. Rather than get into the nitty-gritty arguments that leftist geneticists have with race realist geneticists, let us look at what race is even purported to be. According to Merriam-Webster, race is a breeding stock of animals, a family, tribe, people, or nation belonging to the same stock, a class or kind of people unified by shared interests, habits, or characteristics, an actually or potentially interbreeding group within a species, also a taxonomic category such as a subspecies representing such a group. Breed, or a category of humankind that shares certain distinctive physical traits. It's worth noting that the word race is used in many European languages to denote the very concept of breed. For example, in Spanish, one would simply say that El pastor alemán es una raza de perro. Does this mean that dog breeds are a social construct? Should we not allow the Navy SEALs to discriminate against pugs when they opt for the Belgian Malinois? In any event, if people can put aside their distrust of white lexicographers for a moment, we can see that, in a sense, race is essentially a shared common ancestry. Personally, I grew up watching my father compile genealogical books of our family lineage, with thousands upon thousands of individuals from the mid-Atlantic region of the United States. I regularly met people who were my 4th, 5th, 6th cousins and beyond. In theory, although not in practicality, a person could make a book listing the entire genealogical history of the human race. Such a book would eventually trace us all back to some regional form of Homo erectus and beyond. In a real sense, race is simply a distant delineation of our large, extended family of the human race as a whole. Now, genealogy and population genetics are certainly not the same thing, but the fact of the matter is that even though I've never been to Germany or Nigeria, I have far more in common genetically with Germans than I do with Nigerians. Germany is the land that gave birth to most of the genetic material inside of me, and were I able to travel to Germany and continue my father's work, I could certainly trace where my lineage split with other people from the Palatinate back in the 1760s. In theory, I could also travel much further back in time, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years, to get to a point where Nigerians and I potentially share a common ancestor. But this is extremely distant, and I argue that I have a right to give preference to Germans over Nigerians if I want to. Now, let me be clear, giving preference to someone doesn't mean harming someone else. And moreover, I really don't think that Nigerians are going to cry themselves to sleep tonight knowing that some dude on YouTube realized that he's more related to Germans than he is to them. Oh, but nationalism and ethnocentrism make you care about some humans over others, even if you know nothing about them because they were born with the right skin tone or on the right side of a line. Well, dear God, please tell AIPAC about this, and afterwards, never join a police force or fire department, and never become a doctor or a paramedic because you might be required to indiscriminately help people you don't know anything about. And why doesn't this logic extend itself to third world refugees and migrants? I don't know anything about these people, and why should I help strangers less related to me over strangers who are more related to me? I no longer wish to participate in the melting pot, nor do I wish to see Europe conquered by foreigners. Many of you will condemn me as extreme and hateful, despite numerous occasions in which you'll probably champion the right of various indigenous peoples around the world to remain autonomous and separate. Many of you will accuse me of excluding others and of masking a nefarious genocidal intent. But it is you who are excluding me from the rights generally granted to any distinct group of people. It is you who mask your genocidal intent to see me and my people disappear under the guise of supposed inclusive diversity. While you depict me as tyrannical and authoritarian, it is you who are the tyrants. As Ernest Renan also said, and I'll read this one in English because I know people are sick of the French at this point, quote, "A nation is a large-scale solidarity held together by the sacrifices made in the past and by those we are prepared to make in the future. While a nation presupposes a past, it is summarized in the present by a tangible fact, namely consent, the clearly expressed desire to continue a common life. A nation's existence is, if you will pardon the metaphor, a daily referendum, just as an individual's existence is a perpetual affirmation of life. That, I know full well, is less metaphysical than divine right and less brutal than so-called historical right. According to the ideas that I am outlining to you, a nation has no more right than a king does to say to a province, 'You belong to me, I am seizing you.' A province, as far as I am concerned, is its inhabitants. If anyone has the right to be consulted in such an affair, it is them. A nation never has any real interest in annexing or holding on to a subdivision against its will. The will of a nation is, all in all, the sole legitimate criterion, the one to which we must always return."